In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he tells Christians to put on the whole armor of God. He then describes the different pieces of armor the Christians are to put on. He is likely employing a literary convention of epic Greek poetry called an aristeia. And in an aristeia, the poet describes in detail the armor that the hero puts on right before he goes on a killing spree, right before he slaughters his enemies. In the Iliad, we see this with Achilles before he routs the Trojan army and kills their champion Hector. In the Odyssey, we see Odysseus do this right before he slaughters his wife's suitors. Paul is likely applying this aristeia to the church, which means he's applying it to the Christian, which means the Christian and the church are about to go on a killing spree. There is an offensive warrior action that Paul is applying to the church. In another place, Paul says that Jesus must reign until he places all enemies under his feet, that the reign of Jesus is one which stacks the dead bodies of his enemies underneath him. And Jesus himself says that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. All of this shows that the new humanity under Christ, the church, is an attacking force. It's an offensive army, that we are engaged in offensive warfare in our dominion. But a pitfall that I see many conservative, culturally minded Christians falling into is one where they functionally turn their warfare from an offensive endeavor into a defensive endeavor. That conservative Christians are constantly reacting and not proacting. That they react to each clown world headline that appears, that they share it and they post it, and they have basically a hot take or a blog on the most recent asinine thing that's happening in the world. That each new form of degeneracy is received with astonishment and wagging of heads, and there's constant reaction to it. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for this kind of thing. We should deconstruct this stuff and we should shame it or whatever. But the problem is it can cultivate a posture of reaction, and we don't want that. We don't want Christians who become reactive to the world. Being reactive like this is a subtle way of letting the world control you, rather than you controlling the world. If your battle plan is largely reacting to things, you are going to lose. Anyone who has spent time in studying the art of war knows this. If you are merely reacting to your enemy, you're already losing the battle. A real world example of someone who generally did not operate defensively, what I'm saying we should not do, was President Donald Trump. He would say or do something, everyone would lose their minds and attack him. Then he would go on to the next thing, say or do something else. Everyone would lose their mind, talk about it for a few days. It would make headlines. Then he would go and do something else, say something else, move the capital from Tel Aviv in Israel to Jerusalem. Everyone would lose their mind, talk about it for a few days, make headlines, and Trump was on to the next thing. That was the Trump presidency, and what Trump was doing there was controlling the narrative. Everyone was constantly reacting to him. He wasn't reacting to people, he was making them react to him. And so I use this just as an illustration of how Christians ought to be engaged in the world. As Christians, we're called to discern the times, to find the ways of attacking that forces a reaction, to find ways of fighting that are not merely reactions to our enemies. We are to fight in such a way that takes dominion, that controls the narrative, that forms the culture to us, not us to the culture. As Christians, we take dominion of our environment. We don't let the environment take dominion over us. That's why Christian nations are not filled with people living in grass huts and afraid of trees. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to our King Jesus, and we share in that authority as we are united to him and receive his inheritance. This means he expects us to be faithful and shrewd soldiers in his kingdom. This reminds us of our need to confess